Hello, Poorna Bell. What a delight to actually meet you. We've met virtually, and obviously I've read your books, your non-fiction and your fiction books, so I kind of feel like I have a way into you. And you're known as a freelance journalist, as a broadcaster, and as an author, and as a powerlifter, and now a jiu-jitsu. What are you, gold belt? No, black belt.
No,
white belt.
I wish. No, I'm a lowly white belt.
White belt. So the question that I ask all of our guests, and I'm so glad you agreed to come on the podcast, because I think everyone listening will find your story and what you have to say really relatable, is what is a particular challenge you are facing or have faced?
I had to think really long and hard about this one because there's a number that I could choose from, but I've been a long admirer of your work, and so I feel like you'll receive this in the way that I would want it to be received. I think people would be quite surprised because I'm actually I come across as someone who's quite confident, I think, and someone who has a generally high level maybe of sort of self-worth, which I do have both of those things. But I think the thing that I struggle with, and I don't think I've found the solution to it, is feeling worthy of being loved romantically. And I didn't always feel like that, but it is something that I think I struggle with a lot.
Gosh, that's such a moving and powerful answer, isn't it? Because in some ways you're saying my relationship with myself is a pretty good one. And I feel quite kind of confident about myself and who I am and how I am in the world and my kind of self-confidence in myself. But in daring to let other people love me, I actually feel very vulnerable, or I feel I'm not sure I'm worthy. Is that the...
Yeah, I would say that it's only really something that comes up when, not so much anymore with my friends and family. I think I've worked through a lot of that. You know, that sort of feeling that if I'm someone that gives a lot of love, which I would like to think that I am, then logically it follows that I should be able to receive that love from particularly my close friends and family. And I think I have worked on that a lot through therapy and through a lot of other things. But it is that specific dynamic of meeting someone in a romantic sense. And I'm kind of just processing that at the moment through someone that I recently met, and it didn't work out for different reasons. But it is something that's very fresh in my mind because I find it confronting. I find it really confronting because, you know, as I'm sure we'll get into, there is a lot of stuff in my past that I feel like it's a roadblock that I just can't push past. And there's a part of me that wonders that if I can't really accept that about myself, if I can't accept that in the same way that I would literally give someone, you know, the sun, the moon and the stars, and maybe there's some thinking to do around that.
The dreams.
Yeah, I just... it should follow that I should have that in return, or that it's not outlandish to expect that in return. And that's just something like even as I'm talking to you right now, there's this sort of titanium wall that's just kind of come up. And I think a lot of that is also around forgiveness of the self and just, yeah, it's a big ball of mess, I think.
So you have a lot of awareness, like recognizing that as you're speaking and saying words like should and give the sun and the moon and the stars, that in some ways that's beyond a kind of expectations of an experience. And there's this titanium wall that blocks you.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, many people listening won't know that your husband died by suicide in 2015.
Yeah.
And that my assumption would be, and we know with grief, and particularly around suicide, there are so many assumptions that are often wrong. So my assumption might be wrong, but I'll try it out, which is that you really let yourself jump in and open your heart and trust and fully kind of did love to the sun, the moon, the stars, and felt very loved by Rob, as I've understood your work. And then he killed himself. And so that's a sort of devastating, you know, in the therapy word, that's rupture, but it actually feels more like a grenade thrown into your heart. How do you begin 9 years later to put the pieces of your heart back together to let yourself love again?
I mean, it's exactly that. It does feel like a rupture, and it does. There's things that I've had to do over the last few years to, I think, reconcile. Because I mean, I love reading and I love poetry and I love the arts in general, and I'm aware that sometimes we over romanticize the brokenness of a thing, and whether it's ever possible to fix something, and it's in song lyrics and it's in all of this stuff. So the idea that there might be something in me that it isn't possible to be fixed, it makes me feel awful. And I think that, but I don't think that that's what we're referring to. I think that the way that I feel about that particular moment in time is that I know I'm not the same person. So it's not, it was a rupture, but it's not like everything got smashed and now everything is broken and I'm not a whole person. Like, I am a whole person.
You're a different person.
I'm just a different person. And it is exactly that, as you've described, which is when I met Rob, I did have this very hyperbolic view of what love should be and what that should feel like.
From stories.
From expectations. I am an optimist and a romantic at heart, and I don't think that still hasn't changed, But when I met him and I found what was a counterpart in terms of love and trust and all of those things, it felt like I had found my match, that I had found this person who fit. Yeah. And if there is anyone who hasn't read my work, Rob struggled a lot with addiction, and it was something that I didn't know for a big part of our relationship. And it was something that came out in this sort of, massive confession from him that made sense of a lot of his behavior at the time, but it also forced me to rewrite the things that I had believed were fact that actually really weren't, because I'd only had a portion of the story. And that had its consequences in the aftermath.
It's a double rupture, wasn't it?
It was. And so I think that if we're talking about, coming back to your question about what the challenge is there and where that stems from, I think it's not just all of that surrender, really, to another person, and then to find out that the person that you're surrendering to hasn't really told you the truth about who they are. Yeah, has lied. And, something I'm just increasingly fascinated with is, when people lie by omission and somehow say that they haven't been lying, and that's lying to me, But the big teaching point around that was that he did kill himself, even though I've done a lot in the suicide prevention space, and I talk to people who are in the very early years of struggling to come out of this.
Which is unbearable, those early years.
It feels unbearable. It literally feels like you are on fire having to walk through a world that isn't,
on broken glass, doesn't it? And
it is.
Those questions, what if only I, why didn't I, how could I?
Yeah. And you search for those sort of microseconds in which you might have been able to intervene and so on. And even though on a rational level, I've done everything I can to try and understand the suicidal mindset, I get where Rob was, mentally as a person at the time. And I understand his reasons insofar as, anyone can.
Because in a way, you can never understand it.
You can never fully know. It's a piece of information that you will never have, which is also what I think makes, for people who are, bereaved by suicide, that is also what is so painful underneath it all. But there is a part of me that feels like I failed him. And there is a part of myself that is, I don't know, Julia, that I can ever forgive myself for it. And then the logic for that follows, do I deserve to be loved by someone when the person I loved most in the entire world I wasn't there for, or I couldn't prevent this thing from happening? And that goes in a loop around in my head. And I've tried to, positive reinforcement and all of that stuff. But that rupture that you spoke of, I don't know that I can fill that gap with anything other than the stick that I keep beating myself with,
That's so painful. And also, it seems to me the story you tell yourself about yourself is one where you conflate feelings with facts. So I feel guilty. I feel like I failed. And cognitively in your head, I'm sure there's a perfectly good understanding that this was not in your gift, that you didn't have this power, you weren't God, you couldn't read his mind, you didn't know what was going on. You did not know what was going on for a fair proportion of your marriage, which you couldn't do. But somehow the sort of titanium steel blocker and you and future relationships isn't that you don't dare let them love you, but you don't believe you're worthy of their love because somehow you failed in the love that you had. I mean, it's so annoying as a therapist trying to tell people how to feel or think. So I don't know quite how to frame it, but it feels like a prison sentence that only you can release yourself from.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very powerful visual imagery, really. I think it's
like you've tried and, you know,
yeah.
you've been the judge, the jury,
Yeah.
the prosecutor. You had no defence
Yeah.
and you just stuck yourself in that cell and like...
Yeah. I don't know how to get out of it, though. I know that at some point I have to figure it out. It's also because if it were a friend talking to me about this, if this were a character that I was writing in a book, I would find a way out for them. It's so simple, but at the same time, it's so hard, which is you don't have control over what anyone else does, you know? From the smallest thing to making someone empty the dishwasher to someone holding their life in their hands. None of us have control over what another person does.
We only have control over us.
We only have control over what we're doing and so on. And I think that at some point, I know I do need to let myself out and open the door of things. But I don't know how to do that yet. And I in some ways I've loved
You have to want to first.
Yes. So
it's almost
Yeah.
like, I don't think you wake up one morning and you think, okay, I'm going to let myself off the hook. I'm going to forgive myself. I'm going to give myself a pardon. I think it's in the same way as you've worked in your career, or the same as powerlifting. It's a small step by step, but the first step is I'm going to go there.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with small weights. I'm going to get heavy weights. And also, what you and I have talked about before is that glimmer of hope that I can.
I think you've just made me think of something.
Good.
Which is why you are so good at what you do. I think that... So I'm a massive fan of visual imagery because I find it very powerful, and it's worked with so many other things in my life. So there was someone that I recently had and still do have, I would say very deep feelings for. And this person is someone who I would say was my match. Like
Rob.
I would say in a different way that meets who I am as a person now. If I had met Rob at my age now, we would not have been together, I don't think. But this person, there's a symmetry there that I don't think I've ever felt before. And there is a part of me, I think, that was hoping that things would work out. Because if I saw the way that he felt about me, or the depth of his feeling, then that would be the key that I could use to unlock the door to get out of this prison. And that is not something that he or anyone else can actually give me, because I have to give myself the key, right? And also that prison is very comfortable for me. It's very safe.
Familiar.
It's familiar, when I'm in there, nothing can really hurt me because...
Because what have you got to lose?
Exactly.
You're in fucking prison. It's like, how low can you go? You know, your career can be this side.
Yeah.
You can have a lovely time with your friends and your family, but in your romantic relationship, it's like, I've hit ground zero. Like, I can't really get much lower than this.
Yeah. And it's not comfortable, but it's it's familiar, and there is a weird comfort in that. So I think that maybe that's the work that I need to stop trying to seek it because I don't think this is something another person can give me. And I think I'm also setting myself up to fail, because if that is what I have set myself as the expectation, then that's never going to happen. And so languish in my prison I will, because, I know it very well. So that's definitely something for me to think about. And also that's a very good parallel with powerlifting, or just anything where you are having to steadily build your achievements up, which is something that I do know and I am very familiar with in a more wholesome way, which is that all of that stuff that you're building is only stuff that you can give yourself. It's not something that someone can just hand to you. And if you can lift a certain weight, it's because you've put in the work that you put in yourself in order to be able to do that. And there's no shortcut to it. So perhaps maybe that's the way for me to look at it.
Yes, because as you were saying that, I want to talk to you about the sort of parallel of mental and physical health and strength. But also I was thinking, this person that is your match now, that really fits for you, they've put the key in the door to say, I'm open to you. But unless you're able to be open to receive that, then that, once you can receive that, then that can unlock something in you, because then you begin to feel differently about yourself because you've taken in what they give you.
Yeah.
But when you look at the other person as they are going to fix me or be my solution, it's missing out the vital step of you opening yourself, daring to trust again, daring to take that first small step.
Yeah, I think so. I think that what really helps is listening or hearing the stories of other people who have managed to do that, and aren't necessarily still torturing themselves with things, and
so do you work with SOBS or Papyrus or the suicide charities where you hear?
Not so much. It's more Instagram, if I'm being really honest.
Oh, yeah. That can be very
helpful.
helpful.
That's how I consume things. I love SOBS, and in the sense that I think that what they do is...
So if people listening, it's survivors of bereavement by suicide.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I did engage with them very early on, grief-wise, but it was too early, I think. It was too early for me, and it was too early to hear...
Other people's
stories. It was awful, yeah. And there was just a lot of trauma in the relationships that were left behind in a way that didn't reflect where I was in my own family. So, but I do, especially when people send me messages from time to time, these usually tend to be other widows of people that they've met, families that they've built. And I think, okay, it is actually possible, to be able to move forward with something. So that does help things, I think, a bit.
Yeah. I do think seeing others gives you hope, doesn't it?
It does, because I think your friends and family can support you so much, but there's a point at which you just think, whether it feels, self-pitying or not, they don't know what it's like, really. In the same way that...
Nobody can fully know what it's like.
Yeah, So I think that it does help to be connected to those types of people, I think.
Yeah. So talk to me about the connection between physical and mental health and powerlifting, and how that became a path for you, that you did build some strength, Stronger, as your book is called, after Rob died, where you totally felt when you were kind of on the floor.
Yeah. The thing for me here, whenever I've written about it before, and I'm sure you've had experience with this, is, media publications love to distill it into a throwaway headline of...
A clickbait.
Yeah, this woman solved her grief through lifting weights, and it wasn't that at all, because initially... When I started to learn how to lift weights, this would have been in 2016. And that...
So a year later, quite soon.
This was about just over a year later after he died. It was driven by a very physical need, which was that I just wasn't physically strong enough to do things around the house, and I needed to move house. And he had these massive... plant pots, for example, and I couldn't really lift them or move them around. Yeah.
Such a metaphor.
It is. And And I realized that he had done all of that stuff when he was alive, the heavy lifting. And I'd been really happy for him to do it, actually. In fact, I kind of liked it. And previously, either my dad had done various things, or when we'd gone on holiday, he'd be the ones lifting luggage onto the carousel and all of that stuff. And I realized that I had no desire to live with anyone else. So I was going to face a future in which I was living by myself, which is what I wanted to do. But I needed to be able to do stuff for myself, because I couldn't call my dad, who, doesn't live near me, and my male friends have their own families. So that's really what
So interesting.
sparked that. Yeah.
I need to be able to be self-sufficient. I need to survive. It's a survival thing.
It really was.
I need to pick up my own damn suitcase.
Yeah, it was, in a way that had not presented itself before. So I hired a coach, and I because I didn't know what I was doing, and then I incrementally learned how to lift heavy things. And that was a real sanctuary for me. It was a place where I could see life moving forward when the rest of my life felt like it was
Ground to a halt.
on pause. And it was somewhere that felt very positive for me. There was a lot of positive reinforcement. And
You still get that. I see that on your Instagram.
Yes.
There's so much celebration.
thank you. Yeah, I'm now 43. And I think the older I get, the more it's very clear to me how important that is to continue doing as I
They're
get
your
older.
tribe, one of your tribes.
They are, yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write Stronger was, I'd found a lot of there were a lot of benefits that I'd found through lifting weights, and it wasn't just about physical strength. It was about how it made me feel mentally. It was about how it gave me this, let's say on that sort of trajectory of resilience or whatever, that I felt like I was moving upwards in a way that was quite sustainable and controlled. But it also made me more confident. It made me a lot more aware of my own body language, particularly when I was in a room, let's say with a lot of men, for example, where previously I would have, shrunk into the seat a little bit. I wouldn't have felt like I could hold my own in there. But
now you could lift them up with one hand.
Maybe one and a half, but yeah. Yeah, so that was an enormous benefit to it. But I was thinking, I can't really write a book about this, no one's really interested in it. It's not exactly groundbreaking to lift weights. But then I was doodling around and I came across these statistics, which, so there's obviously a massive gender gap between boys and girls and men and women when it comes to sport or physical activity. And that was worrying in itself, because I could see what the carryovers were for girls, for example, in terms of confidence and that sort of drop off that they had. Yeah. And also then conversely, there was a study done by EY that showed what the levels of confidence and resilience were in, let's say, women who did C-suite jobs who had also done some form of sport. And they had much higher levels of, the ability to troubleshoot and be confident and so on. And so I was fascinated with that. But then I came across this statistic that said out of every demographic in the UK, South Asian women are the least physically active. And I thought, oh God, that is awful. And that's my demographic. And I wanted to do something about that, not just specifically for that community, because I could see that there were enough.
And did that ring true for you? It wasn't just a stat?
It did, because my father is still, he's in his late 70s. He's still fairly physically active, and he lifted weights and he was a runner when I was growing up. And it was his thing. Like in our family, there were no other men that lifted weights. He was the only one. And that was the thing he was known for.
He was an early adopter, to be fair.
He was an early adopter. But in no shape or form did I make that connection that, oh, my dad did that, so I can do that. And that was a problem, because I needed to examine why that was. And so for the same reasons that, women find it hard to, or girls find it hard to connect with sport and physical activities, those things were still present amongst South Asian women. But there was an extra layer of cultural complexity around certain things and how we prioritize academics over sport and so on. That meant that specific demographic, and also hyperfemininity, which is a massive thing in our community, it just meant that it was like a moonwalk for you to be able to take up weights if you were a South Asian woman. And looking at the older relatives in my family and how many of them struggle with osteoporosis and other issues, it just seemed like it was not right, and that I think that they needed to know about that a bit more.
That's such an interesting kind of mix, isn't it? It really is. Because your dad, I mean, that must have influenced you to go to powerlifting 8 years ago. But there was no female role models in your community because of hyperfemininity, because of academics, because of the culture, and because of the patriarchy. It's true. It's true. It must be not as true maybe for white women about weightlifting.
I mean, I would say, so one of the biggest blockers, and it's something that I hear a lot, is women who are scared of either they're scared of getting strong because it involves going to the free weight section in a gym, and that's not the most appealing place. And I understand that, because that is a place that used to terrify me.
Really? I don't understand that. What, a pile of weights sitting in a corner?
It's more the vibe, Julia. It's like the vibe. Yeah, it's the vibe of men, a certain type of man
noise,
in there.
Sounding like they're having sex, don't they?
Yes, yeah. And making a lot of noise and not doing very much. That I can now comment on that. But it is also an environment that doesn't just put off women, it also puts off some men. And then that was a surprise for me, because I didn't know that.
That's a whole thing I did not know.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day.
Yeah, so that is, it's a very intimidating section of the gym, and it is because even though I think things have gotten better in the last couple of years, lifting weights is still, it does feel like it can be quite gendered, you know. It's socially acceptable for a man to put on muscle. It's not socially acceptable for a woman to put on muscle, however advanced we may be societally at the moment. And something that a lot of women struggle with, regardless of your race, is women who don't want to get more muscly, or they don't want to get, quote marks, bigger. And that is something that is still very, very pervasive. Like, women just they want to remain as small as possible physically. And that is a blocker, I think, for most women that I have come across. Not just South Asian women, I would say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They want to stay small.
Yes. And that is patriarchy, because that's patriarchy.
Writ,
yeah,
large.
Yeah, because keep women as small as possible.
Who can't punch you back.
You can't. No, it's very oppressive, I think, as an ideology that we don't even realise we've internalized.
It's funny because I kickbox. I've kickboxed for sort of like 30 years. I mean, not in any competitive way. And I've certainly lifted weights. I mean, only with one hand at the moment. Because I like I'm quite short, and so I like doing the kind of counter to being short and small. I want to be strong and punch above my weight. So I've always done that, and I didn't think it was something that was particularly unusual, I must say. Because I love being able to punch someone and kick someone. I really take enormous pleasure in it. And I often do kickboxing moves with people, particular men, and then I see their fear in their eyes, and it gives me enormous pleasure. Which is slightly counter to what my job is as being empathic and understanding and things. But I also think whatever job you do, you have to do the reverse to sort of balance back.
I love that. Also because I don't know that as women we feel that we're able to own that set of emotions or that need. And I think that is... Aggression. And I mean, lifting is very different to, let's say, martial arts, right? So I started dabbling in jiu-jitsu last year, and this year I began one of my favorite things to do, which is wrestling. So, and it's freestyle wrestling, because there are carryovers from wrestling into jiu-jitsu, especially if one day maybe I try and compete or something like that. Wrestling is something I enjoy hugely because of that aggression that's in there. And because there is a fluidity of movement with your body that I think combines strength and agility. And the way that I would describe it, I think
it's like ballet, but
it is like ballet, but a bit more
with strength.
Yeah, with strength. And the thing that you're describing around, so I did some sparring with, I was in a male class, and I was the only woman in there, so I didn't really have a choice. And I could see the look on their face. I'm sort of a similar height to you, 5'3". they just didn't know that was, that I
A
was going to
thing.
be able to take them down onto the mat. And it was so
Oh
satisfying,
God, it
Julia.
must have
It was
been.
so
Oh,
satisfying. Because also, a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, is it a good way to get your anger out?" And I said, "I don't feel angry when I'm doing it." I said, "I actually feel this sense of emptiness
power.
and power and calm and surety in my own body in a way that I just don't with anything else, It's hard to explain that sensation.
But I do think psychologically, women, I mean, we know with fluidity that nothing is all women or all men, and that we move along that spectrum in different aspects of ourselves. But certainly for me, I'm not very good at being angry. I'm a bit scared of other people. I'm very scared of other people's anger. I'm quite scared of my own anger. So actually, kickboxing for me isn't a way of expressing anger, and it is a way of expressing aggression that feels very healthy, particularly as that most of what I do is very kind of passive and emotional. And, if you look at the research, women aren't as good at handling their own anger, and that often one of the definitions of depression is anger that's gone against yourself, that is internalized. And it is also a route for addiction, is that we can't kind of handle our own fury, which comes from deep hurt. We try and anesthetize those feelings with lots of different behaviors.
Yeah, similar to you, I don't think I'm an angry person. It would take so much for me to get angry that I am afraid of that anger, because I know that when I'm pushed to a point of anger, it means that some serious shit's gone down. Do you know? Do you know what I mean? So, and sort of conversely, I'm fascinated when I see angry people. I have like relatives who are just permanently pissed off, like all the time.
Grumpy at
Yeah,
low level and furious at high level.
and just furious at the most random things, where I just think, I don't know how you have the energy for
It's so
that. It's
exhausting.
so exhausting. And they're exhausting to be around,
Yeah. Because you have to tiptoe.
You have to tiptoe, or you have to listen to it, or you have to absorb it. And so I do a lot of how I think I try and just move through life in general is just not to, it's not even a suppression of anger. I just don't want to give it that oxygen.
Yes.
But you're right in that there are places that has to go somewhere, and I feel like especially physical movement for me, and physical movement in that way, whether it's, let's say, jiu-jitsu or wrestling. I mean, in jiu-jitsu, there's more strangling with you're choking someone with your limbs or your legs. Whereas wrestling, you're just barreling into someone like a rhino, which is my favorite thing to do. But yeah,
So fun.
it's so fun. But I feel,
And the opposite
yeah.
of hyperfemininity.
Yeah, it really is. But I feel like that for me is a much more, I would prefer to let my anger off that way than it just build up into this volcano that then just erupts. That's what scares me about myself, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. So can we segue into the themes of your wonderful new novel, This Is Fine?
Thank you.
And in a way, it's an alongside projection that's made about women, which is about childlessness and making decisions to have children or not to have children. And that's one of the central themes in this novel. And I don't know how much you want to talk about how it relates to you personally, or whether this is just something that you're interested in. But I mean, I know that you don't have children, and I don't know whether you plan to have children or...
So I don't have children, and I don't want children either. And so there is no plan to have them, and
It's more than that. There's a plan not to have them.
It's a plan not to have them. And it's not a sad thing for me. It's just something that I think I decided sort of on the cusp of turning 40, that I definitively knew at that point that I didn't want them.
Was that to do with your age, that it was less likely you'd successfully have them?
No, I think it was just I'd never... I mean, this is me personally. I'd never really ever felt maternal, and I'd never felt a huge drive to have children in the way that I've seen some of my loved ones possess that urge and that drive. And I think that I thought I would have them when I was married to Rob, But if I'm being very honest, Julia, I felt like it was part and parcel of being married and then, you
It's the
know,
deal.
yeah, just sort of having this very like heteronormative life. And so I don't think I'd ever really questioned, is it that I actually wanted children, or did I feel like there was this thing that I had to fulfill? And I think after,
And I don't mean particularly in your community, because I think it's in all
yeah,
communities, but I think as a South Asian woman, it would be very, it would be expected of you, no?
it is. I mean, it's. I would say that pressure for sure to have children is very heightened in my own community. I do now know of a few couples here and there who don't have children. I don't know what their reasons are, which are their own, but it is something I'm seeing a bit more.
I am in my
Yeah, a
caseload.
bit more often. But I
And that
think,
it's voiced more.
yeah, yes, yeah, and also these people are leading very rich lives. Do you know what I mean? Very fulfilled lives. So, but I don't know that people of my parents' generation are ever really going to understand that. I think they still think that there's something missing for them. But you know, you can only explain that I think so far.
So is your mum
Mm.
upset?
I think it's not that she's necessarily upset per se, but I think she would have wanted me to have had children. I think she feels like because it was so fulfilling for her, she wanted that for me. And when I tried to explain to her that I just didn't want that, I explained it as patiently as I could. I'm not sure if she quite, I think she can respect my reasons for it, but I don't know if she understands it in the same way. Um, and I think it is
She
something,
can't really get into
yeah.
your mindset, can she?
No,
She's in her
because,
own, like her experience is so
yeah,
powerful.
yeah, it's just something that I don't think we're ever necessarily going to meet in the middle on. But similarly, the way that I know that she respects my decision making about it is it's not something she brings up in conversation, really. You know, it's something that she accepts is the path that I've chosen. But retrospectively, when I look back on things, I'm mostly glad that I didn't have children. I don't know that it would have been the right choice for me. I don't know that I would have felt as fulfilled by it as I've seen, you know, for example, my sister with my niece and other people that I know. But the conversation around childlessness or choosing to not have children, sort of just taking it back to my protagonist, was I'd wanted to tell the story of someone where the entire book isn't defined by her decision not to have children. It's one of the sort of imperatives for sure in terms of the plot. But I also wanted to just show that it's not as black and white a decision as people think. And over the years, you hear a lot about like other people's opinions about whether or not you should have children. And a lot of that is, you know, oh, but they're wonderful, and you might regret not having them, and there's this sort of litany of very similar phrases, and also the assumption sometimes that you don't like children, and so that's why you've chosen not to have them. And I wanted to show that it's not necessarily as linear as people might think. It's not necessarily as black and white as that. There can be grief that comes from choosing not to have children. For me, there will always be a percentage of me that will say, what if?
Mm.
But I know that if I'm doing my own personal mathematics, I can live with that percentage versus having a child and then realizing it was not the right decision. And the thing that always makes me very curious when people say the thing about it's very fulfilling, it's this and it's that, is I know so many people who are affected by having distant parents who just were bad parents, you know? And that I felt was missing from that conversation around things.
But not just having bad parents, but having a real difficulties being a parent.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
struggling
Yeah.
majorly, and that their children, for all the different reasons that there are in the world, their mental health, or their
Mm.
not the children they expected, or that somehow they feel they failed their children, they've been about. I mean, there are so many different reasons. You know, I think the stigmatization of not having children isn't by any means equaled by the recognition of
Mm.
how hard it is having children.
Yeah. And I wonder, the recognition of how hard it is having children, I there's a part of me that thinks, is it because everyone feels that they need to portray a version of parenthood because saying that it's really hard is really difficult, or that those
That
spaces are just
somehow
not
they
there,
failed.
that somehow they failed, or that they're saying that they're not grateful or happy or lucky to have children, and that is also a conversation for sure that I'm interested in.
And that both things can be true.
Both things can be true, and there can be space, I think, for both things, but also, you know, for example, I mean, I've waived my anonymity about this, so I don't have a problem saying it on the podcast, but I'm in I'm in Al-Anon, so I'm in a version of a 12-step support group, and the I'm there because of Rob and because of the sort of the long shadow that having a loved one with addiction casts. But there are lots of people in there who have children who are either in active addiction or who are recovering addicts. And that is a lifelong journey. You know, your life is never really free from that. And there are different outcomes. Some of them are in positive places, some of them not so much. But this idea, which is actually a conversation I had with my mother around who will look after you when you're older.
Oh, yeah, that's the big part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I just said, well, I said, I kind of actually want to be in a commune of women who look after each
Yes,
other.
I love that idea.
I said, that sounds fantastic. I said, because it is such a shaky retirement plan to think that I'm going to have a child and then that child is going to do various things with its life to then be looking after me. I just said, that's not what my thought process would be. But I understand that it might be for her. But that's also something that's not just come from her. It has come from other people, you know?
And also, I mean, I get the sort of the maths that you do, and you have this percentage that you wonder, shall I regret it? Every decision that we make, we say no to something else. And so we can, all of us have piles of those, you know, is this the right person to marry? Is this the right job to take? So, I mean, I think there's that unlived life box in ourselves of the paths that we didn't take, that we have to kind of recognise is the cost of making good decisions. And good decisions are a big part of our outcome as human beings. But also in parenthood, I thought that what the issue that your book raises is that we can have very profound, deep, loving relationships with young people, with your niece, with the niece in the book, with lots of young people, that it doesn't fill your own child's kind of space, because maybe that isn't even there, but it is profoundly loving and meaningful and important for them. I mean, I see my grandchildren who have very powerful relationships with their aunts and uncles, that is very different from their parents. You know, it's that idea of it takes a village. They get something from them that they could never get from their parents. And so it's this wonderful reciprocal relationship that's good for both.
Yeah, and my cultural heritage is Indian. You know, the idea of a nuclear family is not really how our community works. There are lots and lots of people that have a hand in raising you, you know, and I would say this is probably more so for my sister, who spent more time in India than I did, and I spent about 5 years of my childhood there. But you have lots of people doing the work, whereas here
everyone's called an auntie, aren't they?
Yeah, everyone's an auntie and an uncle.
An uncle.
And here it's so much smaller than that.
Yes.
And so this idea, for example, that I wouldn't have a hand in raising my niece doesn't even occur to me, that I'm going to keep her at a distance or that I wouldn't be in her life, which in the book, you know, the sort of the premise of it is that you've got this woman, Padma, whose niece, Myra, is 15, so much older than my niece. But they're sort of thrust together and they're kind of having to forge this relationship with each other. And I think that idea, exactly to that it takes a village, is something that I really wanted to explore in that book. And also how important it is to sometimes work out what are those things that you're holding on to from the past that are still holding you back from being able to be open to creating a different kind of relationship with people. But with my niece, I view myself as one of her parents, like someone who is raising her and bringing her up. And having also seen, especially on Rob's side of the family, who I have a very close relationship with Rob's family.
That's so lovely that's continued.
Yeah, I
For
mean,
them, it must mean so much.
It does on both sides. You know, my
Yeah.
mother-in-law, who I've spoken to every 2 to 3 weeks since he died for 9 years, the relationship that we have, God, that makes me feel emotional. We have worked so hard, but it's also been effortless. It hasn't been a struggle, but we're all very aware of what a gift that was to have each other. But, you know, Rob's on his mum's side of the family.
What is it that touches you, that she loves you like a daughter?
She loves me like a daughter, so I'm very aware of how lucky I am to have two mothers and what that relationship feels like. But also because what I've seen is such a common thing when a family loses someone to suicide is it breaks that family up because there's so much blame.
Pulls them apart.
And recrimination, and it pulls them apart. And I think that we decided within, it was so soon after he passed. It was something his aunt said to me. It was something that I said to them. And we just said, it's not our fault. It's not your fault. And we love each other. And that's the only path. That's the only way through this. And if we were to tear each other apart about what should have been done and what should have been said, what does that give you?
Yeah.
It takes so much more away
damage
from you.
Yeah.
So collectively, as a family, we made that decision, I think, whether, it was verbalized or not. And Rob had a lot of aunts. Like, on his mum's side of the family, she has a lot of siblings. And I then found out how some of them had played such a major role in, like, helping to bring him up and his other cousins. And that was something that made me realize how important that extended family is as well. And that actually you can parent someone even if you're not their biological parent. Yes. And that has always stayed with me, I think.
And I mean, what happens with suicide, because it's a trauma response, people go into fight, flight or freeze, and they fight and they destroy and they stay in that heightened state. And the thing that is mostly profoundly healing, if that's the right word, but it's a bit of a kind of lazy word, is the love of others. And that you share the love of Rob, because the love for him never dies. And so that you could each find it within yourselves to give love and receive love to each other in memory and in honor of the love you all feel for him. I mean, it sounds so beautiful and also rare.
Yeah, you'll know of this trope, when someone dies by suicide, where people think that they either didn't love everyone in their lives and that's why they did it, or, it's a selfish decision. But I think the type of person that Rob was, he was very complicated. He did have some qualities that were absolutely exasperating. But he was someone who brought people together, and he loved people. He was very heart first as a person. Like, he loved people. He was good at loving. He was, yeah. And he made you feel loved, like you were the sort of center of his universe. I think maybe if it had been a different type of person, maybe things would have been different. But I think that there was a sense of what would he have wanted from this. And he loved family. He loved the idea of being inside a big family. And so the idea that we wouldn't really treat each other with love or respect didn't feel like it was going to be true to his memory. Like, he would have hated that. Yeah. And I'm not saying every relationship is perfect or has survived, but he would have hated the idea of people not talking to each other or fighting with each other. And at the end of the day, if you hold on to those emotions of guilt and recrimination and accusation, where does it take you? Like, what's the end of that? To what purpose? And it's not going to bring him back. So I think that, it's as cheesy as it sounds, I think that love is the only way through.
It is
really
the only way through. That's a very moving place to end our conversation. Is there anything else you want to say? Do you want to tell people where they can find you? Tell them about your book.
It's called This Is Fine. I promise there is some humour in it, so it's not a heavy read, but it does touch upon a lot. It touches upon the type of person that sometimes when we lose sight of ourselves, how we get back to that self, family connections, uncovering bits of the past, and you can get it anywhere. And you can find me on social media at Poorna Bell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Poorna, for a really beautiful conversation.
Thank you.
Hello, Sophie and Emily. I'm the daughter segment for Poorna Bell, and her kind of life experiences and how she found resilience, the books that she's written, and lots of subjects about the grenade in her heart, the suicide of her partner, how she dares to love again, and the decision not to have children, the very valid decision not to have children.
Such a powerful, courageous role model, isn't she? There's something about being a countercultural figure that I think can be so helpfully disruptive, can't it? That she has been brave enough to be and live in weightlifting and in choosing not to have children. She talked about how that's not what's expected of women of her background, of her cultural background. And
in particular, and most cultural backgrounds.
And for women in general, right? And that even though we might not choose to go and be weightlifters, or we might not choose to go and not to have children, they can still resonate with parts of ourselves, right? I definitely resonate. I'm not about to go and do what she does with weights, but it
Really?
helps. Oh, surprise to the family.
I'd like to.
And of course you would.
Well, of course you
and
would.
Suk
That's
are very
not
different.
I'd love to be a weightlifting champion. I would love it so much.
Super cool.
The granny champion.
They're super cool. But I could still take something from that, right? As this feeling of what's the right words?
Openness to being different, or
no, I mean yes, but no, in the sense of like this strong woman who's awesome, and to feel like I could go and be strong. I might not go and be strong like that, but by disrupting these things, you kind of break out of like the plurality of options for what someone might choose to be in their lives. So
like I can make my own decisions.
Yeah, I can go and do the stuff that I want rather than what's expected of me, right? That's the sort of bigger
inspiration
opportunity that can come from people who are courageous to put their version of how they've made choices that may be different to what was expected of them.
I also I think her opening just packed such a punch, like her sort of vulnerability to be able to say, and I think vulnerability is closely tied into what you were saying, Soph, about her powerfulness, to sort of say the challenges to feel worthy of being loved romantically. Like my jaw sort of, I mean, I didn't know anything about her, so I hadn't heard the rest of the narrative before, when I heard her talking about that the sort of challenge of being loved romantically is such a sort of open and honest thing to say. And obviously she has her own narrative around where that came from, that sort of feeling of not being worthy. But I think it's an experience that lots and lots of people can resonate with, because I think we talk a lot about difficulties in relationship, difficulties loving other people and other people's, the challenges of relationships in general. And I don't think that we talk as much about finding it difficult to be loved. And I think many people to dare. And I think lots and lots of people are able to give love and find it much, much more difficult to receive love, particularly in like intimate partner relationships. You can be somebody who feels lovable in all these other relationships, like with your family, with your friends, but there's something that's so intimate about sort of partner relationship that brings up, I think, a lot of things for lots and lots of people, that it can feel really difficult to like allow somebody to love you. And so I think I sort of felt grateful to her for really naming that.
Yeah. I did too.
It was moving to hear, wasn't it?
Much more common than as you say we talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that was put beautifully in, and it made me think about when you've been hurt so deeply. And I'm not saying this is Poorna's story. This is sort of what it made me think about, but that in the process of recovery, we kind of need to feel strong again, like find ourselves again, and reassert some sense of agency in the world, and feel that we can control aspects of our lives, and then establish our boundaries, or whatever that is, whatever's felt most hurt. But then there's the challenge of the next phase of softening again. Do you know what I mean? And it made me think about we've had this kickboxing teacher, Keith, since we were kids, and Mum still sees Keith, as does
and Tash
and you talked about
and
him.
Benj.
Yeah. So Keith tells this story about how initially when he first started learning to kickbox, he was a very angry young man. And he would train and train. He used to do things like smashing his shins against concrete bollards to
Oh God,
desensitize
yes, I've
them
forgotten that.
to feeling. And then he said he found himself, I know it's a bore. Then he found himself sitting on the tube in London, imagining himself beating everybody up in his head. And he suddenly was like, oh, this is not good. Like somehow by being physically aggressive in kickboxing all the time, I'm becoming strong, and also like getting control over my anger through becoming strong and skilled. But it's also putting me in a headspace of like attack. And so he had to learn how to be soft. And so he now is also amazing at Tai Chi and Qigong. I say Qigong? Do you know what I mean? Anyway, Qigong, something like that. So I apologize. But it's like soft, right? And gentle, and it requires his body to go soft. And he said, you know, you need that yin and yang. Otherwise you become, it takes over kind of thing. And it made me think of him and that kind of, if you've become quite in control and strong,
You could be armored.
how does one also learn how to sometimes also open and soften? And that's, you know, often our coping strategies sort of control strategies, because that makes us feel safe. And being in relationship is not being in control. By intimate relationships are like opening to chaos, potentially to the unpredictableness of another person's behavior and feelings. And that's massively challenging, particularly if you've been deeply hurt, whether that's as a child or as an adult.
I mean, it's sort of terrifying, isn't it? I mean, I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about was how complicated it is to grieve somebody who died by suicide. Poorna's so incredibly articulate about the challenges of that, and the sort of challenge of rationally knowing that there was nothing that you could do, alongside the inevitable, like, what if? And I think it's the sort of what if, not just of the actual moment that happened, but like, what if I had noticed more before, or what if I had done more before? Like, there's the sort of
tyranny
torture,
of what ifs.
the total torture of what ifs that's completely unbearable. Like, if I had realised X, then I would have done X, alongside the sort of missing of the person, right? There was a person that, I mean, and being angry with them, and so it makes the sort of more typical grieving process so much more complicated, I think.
It really does. And one of the expressions I heard about death by suicide is that it's indigestible. That in order to adapt, and grief is naturally adaptive, we can process it. But there's something about suicide is that we can't process it because we can't kind of take it in, because it is so transgressive of everything that we've known and trusted and wanted, and against kind of basic belief of living and surviving.
And I think there's still shame.
A lot of shame. People still talk about, instead of died by suicide, committed suicide, like committing a sin. And those in the know don't say committing suicide. And that was also because you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground if you
It was
died by
illegal.
suicide. It was illegal. Yeah.
And also that many people are still part of communities which it is considered shameful and sinful for someone to commit suicide, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere in the world. This is not, there are communities in which it has been acknowledged as not a shameful thing, but there are still so many places that are, or communities in which it is. And also, I think that what if is, you know, it is an inevitability that is part of the process of living with, alongside losing someone to suicide, death by suicide. And maybe you have something more to say about that, Mum, but I think sometimes when you can know that that's just part of the process of what it is to grieve someone who has died by suicide, there might sometimes then help offer yourself a bit more compassion for that as the thoughts and the questions that will come. But that does not mean the same as there was in fact something that you could do to have stopped it happening. That those thoughts will come, the guilt will come, the shame will come, perhaps, but that's not an indicator of your failure. It's sort of an inevitable part of what the impact of that is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's not conflating the feeling with the fact.
Which is such a helpful thing to remember, whatever situation you're in.
Yes.
Feelings are not facts.
And to come full circle, the thing I was going to add is that I do think all of us have a kind of magical thinking about our love, is that if we love well enough, good enough, strong enough, then we keep people we love alive. And that could be people that die from an illness that we sort of somehow feel that we failed when they die. We didn't call the doctor. There are lots of regrets around different kinds of death. But I think particularly with suicide, and to link to Poorna's being able to trust again, if I'd loved right, if I'd loved enough, then he wouldn't have taken his own life. And I remember a young child saying to me, whose father died by suicide, saying, everybody tells me he loved me, but it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a sort of, I think, why lots of people don't even tell their children that their parent died by suicide. But your child will find out.
No, they will. They need to be told the truth.
Yes, in the way that you would want them to, instead of finding out some other way. But it's an unbearable conversation to have precisely because of those kinds of questions. Like, how do you answer that?
We naturally want to protect our children, and sometimes protection by not telling them does them more harm.
That they need the truth, and then to be able to feel what they feel about the truth. Very painful.
And I can feel all of us feeling so sad, and the suicides that we've had in our family, and like, oof, it's so tough.
Yeah.
Is there anything we want to touch on about this choice of not having children?
It's just sort of totally bizarre to me that there's still a stigma about being childless, but I think that there is. Like, it sort of makes you maybe, what is the association? Like, somehow it makes you a less warm person, a less maternal person.
There's something wrong with you.
The amount of insensitive, intrusive remarks people make without intentionally, often not intentionally, about like your body, and you just, honestly, you don't know what's going on in somebody's life. So unless they bring it up, just don't comment at all. Like, shut up. You don't know, maybe they're desperate to have children and they can't, in which case that's incredibly insensitive. Or they've decided not to, in which case it's none of your business. Like, move on with your life.
I love your fury. I love your fury.
Yes, it's somehow the question of having children has gone in the small talk bucket. And it shouldn't be in the small talk bucket. It's the big talk bucket. You know, this is the deeply meaningful chats. These are not. They're so ever-thinking of having children.
And it's also but you know, you're very attractive. Why are you single? What's wrong with you?
I had that a lot.
That's bad.
It's all my siblings' weddings. And I think even once you have children, people who sort of, you're always asked, are you thinking of having a third or a second or a thing? And again, it's like, that could be a totally innocuous question for that person, but it also could connect to some really like deeply painful things. So just, unless they bring it up, just keep your mouth shut.
So our rule for our listeners is that deeply personal questions about who you're in a relationship,
your
how
body,
many children, and your body, don't bring them up or ask the question, but respond to when someone raises it. And this isn't a small talk bucket; it's a big, intimate talk, trusting talk, time
most
with time
most of the time,
which includes commenting on people who have lost weight.
Yes.
People comment as though that's a nice thing to say to people. It is a complicated thing to say. It is a complicated thing for a lot of people to hear. And it's just, again, it's not the casual chat of commenting on other people's bodies. It's a no-no.
Yes, okay. I think particularly if you know that they've sort of struggled, like...
even if they haven't.
Well, even if they haven't, but I think I talked before about having an eating disorder, and people would say when I'd put on weight, you look so healthy. Oh. You look really well.
So well, code.
I'm just like, this is like, no, why do you have to say that? I don't mean that.
Yeah.
And they're being kind. They were being kind. I know they're being... People's intentions are, I think, like 99% of the time...
well-meaning.
Really well-meaning. But just, think about it.
So on that note... I think we could write a book about rules of engagement in conversations. Thank you both. I love you being so feisty, my two feisty daughters. And thank you so much, Poorna, for bringing the feistiness and also the compassion and sensitivity out in us from such an open and wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful to you and for the work that you do. And for all of you listening, please share this if you think it's going to be helpful to others. And thank you very much.